For 50 years, I poured my sweat, tears, and youth into that house. 50 years. And yet in one ordinary morning, my son, the son I once starved myself to raise, sat down in front of me, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you should move somewhere else." No trembling hands, no blushing, as if he were kicking out a tenant who was late paying rent. If you think the story ends with my tears, you're wrong. Like, comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will leave you speechless. I want to tell you something I've never admitted out loud before. For most of my life, I believed that if you loved your family hard enough, if you worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, stayed quiet enough when it hurt, love would come back to you. Not immediately, maybe. Not perfectly. But eventually, it would return. Like a debt. Like gravity. I was 68 years old before I understood how wrong I had been. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and for 47 years I lived in the house on Sycamore Lane. It wasn't a grand house. It had a low ceiling in the hallway that my husband Gerald used to hit his head on every single morning for 20 years. And every single morning he'd say the same thing: "One of these days I'm going to fix that." He never did fix it. And when he died 8 years ago, I kept that low ceiling exactly the way it was. I couldn't bring myself to change it. That stupid, inconvenient ceiling was the last joke we ever shared. I raised 2 children in that house. My daughter Carol, who moved to Portland and calls me every Sunday without fail. And my son Ethan. Ethan, who sat across from me at the breakfast table on a Tuesday in October and told me it was time for me to leave. Let me back up, because you need to understand what kind of morning it was. Not a dramatic morning. That's the thing nobody tells you about the worst moments of your life. They rarely arrive with thunder and warning. They arrive on ordinary Tuesdays when the coffee is still hot and the light through the kitchen window is soft and golden and everything looks exactly the way it always has. I had made oatmeal. I remember that clearly because I was stirring it when Ethan came downstairs. His wife, Diane, was already at the table, which was slightly unusual. Diane rarely came down before 9 on weekdays. She worked remotely, kept her own hours, and generally treated the kitchen like a hotel lobby, a place you passed through, not a place you stayed. But that morning, she was already seated, already dressed, already holding her coffee with both hands, the way people do when they're trying to look casual and failing at it. Ethan poured himself a cup and didn't say good morning. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Mom, we need to talk about something." I kept stirring the oatmeal. "Okay," I said. "We've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "Diane and I, about the house, about the future." I set the spoon down on the rest beside the stove. I turned around. There's a particular tone a person uses when they've rehearsed something, when they've practiced the word so many times the meaning has almost drained out of them. Ethan was using that tone. "We think," he said, and then paused, and I watched him glance at Diane for half a second like he needed to borrow courage from her. "We think it might be time for you to find your own place." The oatmeal was starting to stick to the bottom of the pot. I could smell it. I didn't move. "Your own place," I repeated. "Something smaller," Diane said, jumping in with a warmth that was so obviously prepared it made my teeth ache. "Something more manageable for you. Just for you. There are some beautiful independent living communities nearby. We've actually looked at a few, and some of them are really lovely, Margaret. They have activities, social events." "I have social events," I said. My voice came out quiet. I wasn't sure how. "Of course you do," she said. "Of course. But we worry about you. In this big house on your own." "I've been in this house on my own for 8 years," I said. "Since Gerald died." Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, it's not just about that." "Then what is it about?" There was a pause, a real one, not a theatrical one. And in that pause, I saw something cross Ethan's face. Not guilt exactly, more like the particular discomfort of a person who has convinced himself that what he's doing is reasonable and is now confronting the fact that it doesn't quite feel that way. "The house is a lot," he said finally. "The upkeep, the yard, the maintenance. We think it might make more sense," Diane said very carefully, "for us to take over the property, manage it properly. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that anymore." And there it was. Not dressed up enough to hide what it was. Not dressed down enough to be honest. Just floating there between us in my kitchen, in my house, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The thing they had actually come to say. They wanted the house. They just didn't want me in it. Nut. I didn't argue. I want to be clear about that because it still surprises me when I think back on it. I, Margaret Whitmore, who had never once in my life walked away from a fight I believed in, stood there in my own kitchen and did not argue. I said, "Let me think about it." Diane looked startled, like she had braced herself for a storm and the sky had stayed clear. Ethan looked relieved. That relief, that small, unguarded exhale from his chest, told me more than anything he'd said. He had expected me to fight. He had been prepared for me to cry, to raise my voice, to appeal to history and sacrifice and the 47 years I had poured into that house. He had his arguments ready. I could see them lined up behind his eyes, waiting. I didn't give him the chance to use them. "I'll think about it," I said again. "Now, do either of you want oatmeal? It's going to burn if nobody eats it." What I did not tell them, what I did not tell anyone for several weeks, was that I had already been thinking about it. Not in the way they meant, not about independent living communities with scheduled activities and laminated dining menus, but thinking in the way you do when something has been sitting wrong for a long time and you've been too loyal or too tired or too afraid to look at it directly. The truth was, I had been watching Ethan and Diane for 2 years. Watching the way they moved through my house with a particular kind of comfortable ownership that had nothing to do with the fact that they were guests in it. The way Diane rearranged the items on my kitchen counter without asking. The way Ethan started referring to the property in conversation with his friends, as though the house were already something he managed rather than something his mother lived in. Small things. Individually, nothing. Together, a pattern. I want to tell you something about getting older that nobody prepares you for. People talk about the loneliness, the physical changes, the grief of losing friends and spouses. What they don't talk about is the particular quiet horror of watching the people you love begin to look at you like a problem to be managed, like something that needs to be organized, handled, and put somewhere out of the way. I had watched it happen to my own mother, the polite suggestions, the delicate reframings. "It would be easier for everyone, Mom. We just want what's best for you." What they meant, of course, was that it would be easier for them, that they wanted what was best for the situation, that my mother and her feelings and her particular stubborn preferences were, at this point in her life, a complication. I had sworn I would never let it happen to me. I had failed to account for how much I loved my son. Let me tell you about Ethan when he was 7 years old. He had a gap between his front teeth that made him whistle slightly when he said his S's. He was terrified of thunderstorms and would crawl into bed between Gerald and me and lie there so rigid with trying not to show he was scared that he'd be exhausted by morning. He used to leave me little drawings on the kitchen table. Stick figures of the two of us, labeled Mom and me, holding hands with arms that were too long for their bodies. I used to keep those drawings. I had a box of them in the closet. I hadn't looked at that box in years, but I knew exactly where it was. That is the thing about loving someone for 40 years. You can hold two completely incompatible truths about them at the same time. The boy with the whistling gap and the too long arms. And the man who sat across from you at your kitchen table and told you it was time to go. Both of those things were real. Both of them were Ethan. And loving him didn't make the second truth hurt less. If anything, it made it hurt more. Jinan. After they left for their respective work calls that morning, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I looked at the low ceiling in the hallway. I looked at the wallpaper in the dining room that Gerald and I had hung together on a rainy Saturday in 1987, both of us arguing about whether it was level, both of us laughing so hard by the end that we weren't even checking anymore. I looked at the scuff on the baseboard at the bottom of the stairs where Ethan, at 14, had dragged a bicycle inside against my explicit instructions, and refused to admit it had been him for 3 entire days. I looked at all of it, and I let myself feel what I was feeling, which was not sadness, not yet, but something colder, something more like clarity. They thought they knew what was going to happen. They had written the script. Gentle pressure, reasonable framing, perhaps a few difficult conversations, and eventually a capitulation dressed up as a decision. Eventually Margaret would see the sense in it. Eventually Margaret would do what was best for everyone and step aside. They had not considered the possibility that Margaret might have a different ending in mind. 2 weeks passed. I played it very carefully. I didn't bring up the conversation again. Neither did they. This, I knew, was tactical on their part. Give her time to adjust to the idea. Let it settle in. Let the path of least resistance do its work. They were patient people. Ethan had always been patient in the way that certain people are patient, not because he was especially calm, but because he was confident. He had always believed things would go his way if he simply waited. While they waited, I made a phone call. Dorothy Kessler had been selling real estate in our county for 31 years. She had sold Gerald and me the house on Sycamore Lane. She had also sold 3 other properties on our street over the years, and she knew every inch of the neighborhood's value. More importantly, I had known Dorothy since our children were in the same elementary school class. I trusted her. I called her on a Wednesday morning when Ethan and Diane were both in their respective home offices with their doors closed. I stood in the backyard near the old garden where I still grew tomatoes every summer, and I told her what I needed. "Margaret," she said when I'd finished, "are you sure about this?" "I've been thinking about it for a long time," I said. "It's a significant step." "Yes," I said. "It is." There was a brief silence, and then Dorothy said, in the voice of a woman who had been around long enough to recognize when another woman had made up her mind, "All right, let me do some research on current comps, and I'll get back to you Thursday." I went back inside and started making lunch. What came back from Dorothy on Thursday was a number that made me set down my phone and sit very still for about 30 seconds. The house on Sycamore Lane, in the current market, was worth considerably more than I had imagined. More than 3 times what Gerald and I had paid for it. More than enough to do what I had begun, carefully, to plan. I called Dorothy back and said, "Let's move forward." "I'll need to come by for photos and measurements," she said. "We'll need to be a bit strategic about the timing." "Ethan and Diane go to her parents in Connecticut the second weekend of every month," I said. "They'll be gone Friday through Sunday." Dorothy understood without my having to explain further. "I'll block that weekend." That evening, at dinner, I asked Ethan about his plans. Casual, conversational. He confirmed the Connecticut trip, the same as always. Diane talked about her mother's new garden project. I listened and asked follow-up questions and passed the bread. I was extraordinarily calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you have finally decided something. I need to tell you about the debt, because Ethan will tell you a different version of this story if you ever hear it from his side, and I want you to understand what actually happened. 6 years ago, Ethan's business, a small commercial contracting firm he had started with a partner, hit a wall. The partner had made some bad decisions that Ethan hadn't caught in time, contracts fell through, and the company ended up underwater. Ethan came to me on a Sunday afternoon, sat at the same kitchen table where he would one day tell me to leave, and explained the situation. He needed $70,000. Not a loan exactly, he said. A family investment. He would pay it back, of course he would. This was just temporary. He just needed to get through this period, and then the business would stabilize, and Gerald had been dead for 2 years at that point. The money Ethan was asking for was most of what I had in the savings account that Gerald and I had spent 30 years building. I gave it to him. I didn't demand a promissory note. I didn't set repayment terms. I gave it to him because he was my son and he needed it, and I believed in him. He paid back $11,000 over the following 3 years, in small amounts, irregularly, whenever he thought to. Then the payments stopped. He never mentioned it again. I never brought it up. By the time he sat across from me on that Tuesday morning and told me to leave, I had stopped expecting to see the rest of it. I had reclassified it, in my own accounting, from a loan to a loss. A different kind of loss than I'd expected, but a loss. I thought about this while Dorothy was photographing the house. I thought about it while her assistant measured the rooms and Dorothy noted the details of the original hardwood floors, the renovated kitchen, the slope of the backyard. I thought about all the things that money could have been, the trips Gerald and I had talked about taking but never quite managed, the repairs I had put off. The small extravagances I had declined to myself because I was saving for a future that kept getting quietly redistributed. $70,000. The number felt both enormous and small, depending on how I looked at it. Enormous because of what it represented. The material evidence of a life Gerald and I had built together, slowly, carefully. Small because it had apparently cost less than the value of this house in Ethan's calculations. I had been an investment. I was now a liability. It was just business. Dr. Set. The listing went live on a Thursday. Not publicly. Not yet. Dorothy sent it to her network first, the way good agents do with properties they believe will move fast. Within 48 hours, she had 3 interested parties. By the following Tuesday, she called me to say there was a couple who wanted to see it immediately and who she thought were serious. Their name is Brooks, she said. Harold and Vivian, retired. They've been looking for something with character. Their words, for about 6 months. This might be exactly what they want. When do they want to come? Could you manage Friday afternoon? Ethan will be in Connecticut by then? Yes, said. I met Harold and Vivian Brooks for the first time on a Friday afternoon in November, and I liked them within about 4 minutes. Harold was a large, soft-spoken man who had taught high school history for 35 years and carried himself with the slightly rumpled dignity of someone who has spent decades being patient with people who weren't listening. Vivian was small and quick-eyed, with the kind of energy that makes you feel like the room has quietly gotten warmer. They arrived 10 minutes early, which I took as a good sign. I gave them the tour myself. Dorothy had offered to do it, but I said no. I wanted to do it. I wanted the people who might buy this house to hear its history from the person who had lived it. I showed them the kitchen and told them about the wallpaper that Gerald and I had hung on a rainy Saturday, the argument about levels, the laughter that had made us sloppy and not care. Harold smiled at that in a way that told me he knew that kind of afternoon. I showed them the hallway with the low ceiling. My husband hit his head on that every day for 20 years, I said. Vivian laughed. Did he ever fix it? He kept saying he would, I said. Something moved through Vivian's face. Not pity, which I wouldn't have been able to stand, but something gentler. Recognition, maybe. How long has he been gone? She asked. 8 years, I said. She nodded. She didn't try to say something that made it better. I appreciated that. We finished the tour in the backyard where my tomato plants were still standing even though the season was over, dry brown stalks that I hadn't quite brought myself to pull out yet. This is a good house, Harold said. He wasn't talking about the square footage or the condition of the roof. He meant something else, and I knew it. It is, I said. We take care of it, Vivian said. She said it simply, without any particular emphasis, which made it more convincing than if she'd tried to promise it. I know you would, I said, and I meant that too. Dorothy called me Sunday night, after Ethan and Diane had returned from Connecticut, while I was reading in the living room with the television on quietly in the background the way I did most evenings. They want to make an offer, Dorothy said. I turned down the television volume. The offer was $7,000 over asking price. They wanted the house exactly as it stood. The furniture I was willing to leave, the original fixtures, the low ceiling in the hallway. They weren't planning to renovate. They wanted to live in it. Margaret, Dorothy said, this is a very good offer. I know, I said. Do you want to take the night? I thought about Ethan's face that Tuesday morning, the prepared words, the rehearsed calm, the half-second glance at Diane when he needed to borrow courage. I thought about the box in the closet with the stick figure drawings, the 11,000 out of 70, the word property. No, I said. I'll accept it. Dorothy made a small sound on the other end of the line, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something in between. All right, she said. I'll draw up the papers. I turned the television back up. There was a nature documentary playing, something about birds migrating. I sat there and watched it and listened to the house settle around me the way old houses do in the evening. Small creaks, small sighs, the particular language of a building that has been lived in long enough to have opinions. I thought, I will miss you. And then I thought, but I'm not going to lose myself trying to keep you. That was the moment, I think. The real one. Not the day I called Dorothy, not the day I accepted the offer. That Sunday night, alone in my living room, with the birds migrating on the television and the house talking to itself in the dark. That was the moment I chose myself. I spent the next 3 weeks being very normal. I had dinner with Ethan and Diane twice. I did not bring up the conversation about moving. Neither did they. Still waiting, still patient, still confident that time was doing their work for them. I helped Diane carry groceries in from the car one afternoon and listened to her describe a renovation show she'd been watching, all these before and after transformations, all this potential just waiting to be unlocked. She didn't say she was talking about the house on Sycamore Lane. She didn't have to. I said, "That sounds interesting," and asked if she wanted tea. I signed the sale documents on a Wednesday afternoon at Dorothy's office, in a room with a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The escrow timeline was set. The closing date was 3 weeks out. I drove home and started going through 47 years. This I was not prepared for. Not the legal parts, not the financial parts. I had braced myself for those. What I was not prepared for was the physical reality of taking apart the life you have lived. Every drawer, every shelf, every corner of every closet. Gerald's old workbench in the garage, still holding the shape of the projects he'd set down and never come back to. The box of Ethan's drawings, Carol's old school photos in an album on the highest shelf. I called Carol. I had to tell someone. My daughter answered on the second ring, the way she always did. "Mom, is everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "I need to tell you something." I told her everything. From the Tuesday morning conversation to Dorothy, to the Brooks family, to the signed documents. Carol was quiet for most of it, the particular quiet of someone who is listening very hard. When I finished, she said, "Mom." "I know," I said. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything since I decided to marry your father," I said. A long pause. Then Carol let out a breath. "Okay," she said. "What do you need?" That was my daughter. That was always my daughter. Not, "Are you sure you've thought this through?" or "What is Ethan going to say?" or "This feels extreme, Mom." Just, "What do you need?" I told her what I had arranged. A cottage rental on the east side of town, quiet street, small garden, already half furnished. A fresh start that looked more like a relief than a punishment. "I'll come down the week before closing," Carol said. "Help you pack." "You don't have to—" "Mom, I'm coming." So, the last night I slept in the house on Sycamore Lane, I lay awake for a long time. I wasn't sad exactly. Or I was, but it was a different kind of sadness than I had expected. Not the sharp grief of losing something you're fighting to keep, but the softer grief of releasing something you have already made peace with. Gerald was everywhere in that house. The low ceiling, the wallpaper, the workbench in the garage. And I had spent 8 years since his death tending those memories like I was afraid they'd disappear if I stopped watching them. What I understood, lying there in the dark, was that he was not in the house. He never had been. He was in the way I still laughed when I remembered the wallpaper argument. He was in the discipline I'd learned from 30 years of building something with another person, brick by careful brick. He was in the fact that when my son tried to push me out of my own life, I did not simply accept it. Gerald had always said I was the stubborn one. He'd meant it as a compliment. I fell asleep around 2 in the morning. Carol arrived the next day with her station wagon and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a very no-nonsense attitude about boxes. Ethan and Diane left for Connecticut that Friday. By Sunday, I was gone. The legal documents were on the kitchen table. The keys were hung on the hook by the door the way I had always kept them. The house was as clean as I had ever kept it. Cleaner, maybe. I wanted it to be right for Harold and Vivian. I wanted it to be ready. I stood in the hallway one last time and looked at the low ceiling. One of these days, I'm going to fix that. "It's all right," I said out loud to nobody. "Leave it." Then I picked up my bag, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me for the last time. The morning was cold and clear. A good morning. The kind that doesn't make promises, just opens. I put the key in my coat pocket, got in Carol's car, and did not look back. Carol stayed with me for 4 days after we left the house. We didn't talk about Ethan much during those 4 days. There wasn't a lot to say that hadn't already been said, and Carol had always understood, better than most, when silence was more useful than conversation. She helped me unpack boxes, figure out where things went in the smaller space of the cottage, and decide what needed to be returned, donated, or thrown away. She made coffee in the mornings and didn't push me to discuss my feelings, which was exactly what I needed from her. On the third morning, she sat across from me at my new kitchen table, a smaller table, just right for one person, with a window beside it that looked out onto a narrow strip of garden, and said, "He hasn't called you." "No," I said. "He doesn't know yet." "No." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "How long do you think before they find out?" I considered it. "They get back from Connecticut on Sunday. They'll go to the house, and then—" I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Carol looked at me with an expression I recognized from when she was a teenager, that particular mix of worry and stubborn loyalty that had always been her default setting when she was trying to decide whether to argue with me. She decided, as she usually did, not to. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I agreed. We drank our coffee. Outside, a bird was doing something energetic in the small hedge at the edge of the garden, rustling around like it was looking for something it had lost. We watched it for a while, neither of us speaking. That was Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, my phone started ringing. So, I had known it was coming, and still, when I saw Ethan's name on the screen, my stomach pulled tight in a way I hadn't expected. Not guilt. I had worked through guilt weeks ago, turned it over, examined it, set it down. What I felt was something older and more complicated. The particular dread of a confrontation you know is necessary and still don't want to have. I let it ring. He called again immediately, then a third time. Then a text message came through, just 4 words. "Mom, call me. Now." Carol was there. She watched me read it without asking what it said. She could tell from my face. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. "No," I said. "I need to do this myself." She left an hour later, after a long hug and a reminder that she was only 3 hours away, and I should call her the moment I needed anything. I watched her station wagon pull out of the small driveway and kept watching until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then I sat down on the couch in my new living room and looked at my phone. 11 missed calls from Ethan, 2 from a number I didn't recognize. I assumed Diane's cell, which I'd never saved. 1 text. The text was short, but the capitals were doing a lot of work. I put the phone face down on the cushion beside me and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling in the cottage was a normal height, plenty of clearance, no memories. I picked the phone back up and called Ethan. Chindek. He answered before the first ring finished. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. His voice was a register lower than usual, the tone of someone who has been holding a very large thing for several hours and whose arms are starting to shake. "Ethan, what did you do, Mom? We came home and there are people, there are strangers in the house. There's a couple in the driveway, and the woman said they own it. She said they bought it, and I thought it was I thought it was a mistake. I called Dorothy Kessler, and she—" He stopped. The quality of his silence changed. "She told me you listed it 3 weeks ago." "Yes," I said. 3 weeks ago." Another stop. "You've been sitting across from me at dinner. You sat at that table with me and Diane, and you said nothing. 3 weeks." "You sat at that same table," I said, keeping my voice even, "and told me to leave the house I've lived in for 47 years. You'd been planning that conversation for weeks, maybe months. You said nothing either." The silence that followed was different from the others. This one had weight in it. That is completely different. Is it? Mom. His voice cracked slightly on the word, and I didn't know if it was anger or something else. We were trying to have a conversation with you. We were talking to you about the future, about what makes sense. We weren't going behind your back and selling the house. You were trying to take the house, I said. You just wanted me to cooperate while you did it. That is not what happened. Ethan, I took a breath. The house was mine. It was mine and your father's. I had every legal right to sell it. There was nothing underhanded about what I did. You didn't tell me. No, I said. I didn't.
Why?
The word came out raw. Not strategic, not rehearsed, just raw. Why wouldn't you tell me? If you were upset, if you felt like why wouldn't you just talk to me? And this was the moment, I knew, where I had a choice about what to say. I could give him the careful answer, the measured one, the one that would keep the temperature of the conversation from rising further. Or I could tell him the truth. I told him the truth. Because the last time I trusted you with something important, I said, it cost me $59,000, and I never heard another word about it. The silence this time was absolute. Well, I should have brought it up years ago. I know that. Looking back at the decision to stay quiet about the money, to absorb it, reclassify it, move on, I can see it for what it was. Not generosity, not patience. Fear. Fear of what it would mean for my relationship with my son if I named what had happened. Fear of being seen as petty, as mercenary, as the kind of mother who kept score. The irony is that by staying quiet, I had allowed the score to keep growing without either of us acknowledging the board. Ethan didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. That money, he said finally, was 6 years ago. Yes. I've paid back $11,000, I said, over 3 years, then it stopped. Another long pause. I could hear his breathing. I could picture him, probably standing in the driveway of the house that no longer belonged to him, the Brooks family somewhere inside, the legal documents on the kitchen table just as I'd left them. I was going to pay the rest back, he said. I had a plan. Ethan. I stopped him gently, not harshly. You don't have to explain the plan to me. I'm not angry about the money anymore. I let that go a long time ago. But you asked me why I didn't talk to you. Why I didn't trust you. That's why. Because I have given you things. Not just money. Your whole life I have given you things. And I have watched them disappear without a word, without a thank you, without acknowledgement. And when I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, you sat down at my kitchen table and told me to get out. I heard him exhale. It was a shaking kind of exhale. I didn't say it like that, he said, but he said it quietly. No, I agreed. You use nicer words. He called me 4 more times that week. Diane called twice. Those I didn't answer. Each conversation with Ethan shifted slightly, like a wheel trying to find purchase on wet ground. The first 2 calls were still mostly anger, accusations, a lot of language about what I had done to the family, what I had done to him, how I had handled this in the worst possible way. The third call was different. It came on a Wednesday evening, around 7. I was eating dinner alone. Soup, bread, the kind of simple meal I had always made for myself when I wasn't cooking for anyone else. The phone rang, and I considered not answering, and then I did. Ethan sounded tired. Not the tight, controlled exhaustion of someone who is still managing their anger, but genuinely, flatly tired. Where are you living? He asked. A cottage on Elmwood Street, I said. Are you okay there? I set down my spoon. This was new. Yes, I said. It's a good space. I didn't know you were unhappy, he said. I thought about that for a moment. I don't think I was unhappy, I said slowly. I think I was disappearing. Those are different things. What does that mean? It means that for the last few years I've watched myself become invisible inside my own home. I watched the 2 of you make plans for that house, renovations, futures, and nobody once asked what I thought, what I wanted. I became part of the furniture, Ethan, something that was in the way. He was quiet. I raised you, I said. I worked, I scrimped. I showed up when your business was falling apart. I have been there for every single thing you have needed from me for 40 years. And the moment I became inconvenient, the plan was to relocate me to somewhere with scheduled activities and laminated menus. That's not... He started and stopped. Diane thought... I know what Diane thought, I said. I need to know what you thought. A very long silence. I thought, he said, and his voice was doing something unsteady now, that the house was too big for you, that you were alone in it, that it was. I thought it made sense. Did you think about asking me what I wanted? He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Here is what I have never told anyone, not even Carol. There was a night, about 2 years before all of this, when I sat at the kitchen table in the house on Sycamore Lane at 11 o'clock at night, long after Ethan and Diane had gone to bed, and I cried. Not quietly, not delicately. The ugly kind of crying, the kind you can only do when you're certain nobody can hear you. I had done it because earlier that evening at dinner, Diane had made a comment about the kitchen. She'd said something like, "It would really open up with the wall between the kitchen and the dining room gone," and Ethan had said, "Yeah, that would be great," and they'd had a full 3-minute conversation about what the renovation might look like, and at no point had either of them looked at me or lowered their voices or seemed to register that they were sitting in my kitchen discussing the demolition of my wall in front of me. I had sat there and eaten my dinner and said nothing. Afterward, at 11 o'clock, I sat at that table and cried because I didn't know what else to do. Because I felt, and this is the part that is hardest to admit, even now, I felt like I was already gone. Like I had already been quietly moved out, in all the ways that mattered, and only my physical body was still technically present. That feeling, that specific, particular feeling of being erased while still standing in the room, is something I would not wish on my worst enemy. And it is something I had allowed to happen. Not all at once, not through any single dramatic moment, but gradually, across years of small silences and let-go slights and decisions to keep the peace rather than insist on being seen. I had done it to myself, in many ways. I had been so determined to be a good mother, an undemanding presence, a person who didn't cause trouble, that I had slowly cooperated in my own disappearance. The night I called Dorothy Kessler was the night I decided to stop cooperating. Ethan showed up at the cottage on a Thursday afternoon unannounced. I was in the garden when I heard the knock. I'd started working on the narrow strip along the back fence, clearing out what had been left by the previous tenant, trying to figure out what was worth saving and what needed to come out entirely. I was not dressed for company. I had dirt on my knees and my garden gloves in one hand, and I was in no particular mood for a difficult conversation. I opened the door anyway. He looked bad. Not catastrophically. Ethan had always been put together in the way of people who use neatness as a form of control, but there were marks under his eyes and a stiffness around his jaw that told me he hadn't been sleeping well. He was holding a paper bag from the bakery down the street from his office, the one that made the almond croissants I had liked for 20 years. He held it out. "I didn't know what else to bring," he said. I looked at the bag for a moment. Then I took it and stepped back from the door to let him in. He came in and looked around the cottage. Not rudely, not like he was assessing it. More like a person walking into a room they've been trying to imagine and finding it different from what they pictured. Smaller, probably. Simpler. "It's nice," he said. And then, like he felt he needed to explain, "I mean that." "Sit down," I said. "I'll make tea." We sat at the small kitchen table with the window looking onto the garden. I poured tea and set out the croissants, and we were quiet for a moment. Outside, the bird was back in the hedge. Same hedge, same energetic rustling. I had come to think of it as reliable company. "I talked to Carol," Ethan said. "I know, she told me." "She was—" He stopped. "She wasn't very gentle with me." "She never is." I didn't try to soften it. Carol's lack of gentleness on this particular subject was entirely warranted, and we both knew it. Ethan turned his mug in a circle on the table. It was a nervous habit he'd had since he was a teenager, that rotating motion, like he was winding something up. "She said I've been taking you for granted for years, that I've been treating you like—" She used the word resource. "What did you say?" I said she was wrong. He stopped rotating the mug. And then I thought about it for 2 days, and I think she might be right. I looked at my son. This man who had been 7 years old once, with a gap in his teeth and stick figure drawings. This man who had sat across from me with rehearsed words and a borrowed courage. This man who was now sitting in my new kitchen holding a paper bag of croissants like a small white flag. I did not soften. I was done softening. But I did not harden either. "Tell me what you think she means," I said. He looked up. "What?" "If you think she might be right, tell me what you think she means. In your own words." He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might deflect, change the subject, qualify, move sideways the way people do when the truth is uncomfortable. But he didn't. He stayed with it. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been treating you the way you treat someone who's always going to be there. And I didn't think about what that meant for you. I assumed. I assumed you were fine. I assumed the house was too much. I assumed—" He stopped. "I did a lot of assuming." "Yes," I said, "you did. And the money." He said it like setting something heavy down on a table. "Mom, I know I haven't—" "Ethan," I stopped him. "I'm not here to collect a debt. That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" I thought about that night at 11 o'clock, the ugly crying, the feeling of being already gone. I thought about Diane and the wall she wanted to remove. I thought about the word property. "It's about the fact that I spent 47 years building a life," I said, "and somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as the person who built it. I became a part of it. Furniture, something to be managed, and I let it happen. I'm not putting all of this on you, Ethan. I stayed quiet for too long, and that's on me. But when you sat down at that table and told me to leave, what you were really telling me was that my comfort, my wishes, my sense of belonging in my own home, none of that made the list. The house did. I didn't." He didn't argue with it. That, more than anything, told me something had actually shifted. He sat there with his hands around his mug and his eyes doing something that was not quite crying, but was very close to it. My son, who hadn't cried in front of me since he was 12 years old, who had learned somewhere along the way that showing vulnerability was the same as showing weakness. I had taught him better than that, I thought. Apparently it hadn't held. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, no qualifications behind them. No, but waiting at the end. Just the 2 words. I heard them. I let them sit for a moment because they deserved to be heard and not immediately answered. Then I said, "I know." I want to be clear about something, because I think people hear a story like this and they want a clean ending. They want the apology to fix it, the conversation to close it, the relationship to snap back into shape like a rubber band. That is not what happened. 2 words, even genuine ones, do not undo years. What happened was messier and slower and more uncertain than that. What happened was that Ethan drove home that evening and I washed up the tea things and went back out to the garden and pulled up another dead plant by its roots and thought about what I actually wanted the rest of my life to look like. Not what I owed, not what I was expected to do, not how to manage Ethan's feelings or maintain Diane's comfort or keep a peace that had been costing me, quietly, for years. What I actually wanted. It was harder to answer than I expected. I had spent so long organizing myself around other people's needs that my own had gone somewhat quiet from disuse, like a muscle that hasn't been worked in a long time. But they were there, still there, waiting. I stayed in the garden until the light changed. The bird in the hedge had finally found whatever it was looking for, because the rustling had stopped. Everything was very still, the way evenings get in November, that particular quality of quiet that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something else, something patient. I pulled off my garden gloves and looked at my hands. 68 years old, dirt under the nails, still here, still here. The weeks after Ethan's visit to the cottage were not peaceful. I want to be honest about that. People imagine that once the hard conversation happens, once the apology lands and the truth gets spoken, something releases. The pressure lifts. Maybe it does, eventually. But in those first weeks, what I mostly felt was the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves very tightly for a very long time and has just, for the first time, let go. The muscles don't immediately relax. They ache. They tremble. They don't know what to do with the absence of tension. I had been braced for so long. Braced against Ethan's plans, against Diane's careful smiles, Against my own inclination to go quiet and absorb and make peace. Bracing had become so automatic that I had stopped noticing it. Now that I had stopped, I could feel every place it had been. I kept busy. That was always my way. Gerald used to say I was incapable of sitting still when something was bothering me, that I cleaned and organized and gardened my way through every difficulty the same way other people drank or talked or cried. He wasn't wrong. In those weeks, I turned that narrow strip of back garden into something worth looking at. I pulled everything dead, amended the soil, researched what grew well in partial shade. I joined a Tuesday morning walking group through the county parks. 8 women and 1 man named Roy, who walked faster than any of them and somehow never broke a sweat. I started cooking again, properly, not the half meals I had been making for years when I couldn't quite bring myself to use all 4 burners just for one person. Small things. But they added up. And underneath the busyness, quieter than it had ever been before, something was changing. It was during this time that I found out what Diane had actually said. Not to me, to her sister. Her sister's name was Renata, a sharp-tongued woman who had never particularly liked Ethan and made no real effort to hide it. Renata and I had always gotten along in the way of 2 people who don't spend much time together but understand each other when they do. She called me on a Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after Ethan's visit to the cottage, and the first thing she said was, "I want you to know I'm calling you because I think you deserve to know, and not because Diane asked me to. She absolutely did not ask me to." I sat down. When someone opens a conversation that way, you sit down. "Tell me," I said. What Renata told me took about 10 minutes and rearranged several things I thought I understood. It turned out that the plan to push me out of the house on Sycamore Lane had not started the way Ethan had framed it to me. It had not been a slow, mutual realization that the house was too much for me, that I needed a simpler situation, that they were thinking of my comfort. It had started with Diane, about 8 months earlier, when she had discovered, through a piece of mail she had opened, that was addressed to me, which was its own particular violation, that the house was in my name alone and that Gerald's estate had been settled in a way that gave me full ownership and full right of disposal. She had apparently been under the impression, for reasons I couldn't entirely reconstruct, that Ethan had some claim on the property. He didn't. He never had. It had been mine and Gerald's, and when Gerald died it became mine alone, clearly and legally. When Diane discovered this, according to Renata, she had been furious. Not sad, not disappointed, furious, and had spent the following weeks convincing Ethan that it was time to have the conversation. "She told him it was about your welfare," Renata said. "She framed the whole thing as concern for you. I heard her practicing it on the phone with her friend Celia. She said, 'The key is to make Margaret feel like we're doing her a favor.'" I was quiet for a moment. "Practicing it," I repeated. "Margaret, I am sorry to be the one telling you this." "Don't be," I said. "I needed to know." "The thing that made me call you," Renata went on, "is that last week she told my mother, at a family dinner in front of everyone, that you had done something vindictive and cruel, that you sold the house specifically to hurt Ethan, that you had been planning it for months as some kind of revenge. She's been telling that version of events to everyone who will listen." I thought about the Tuesday morning, the rehearsed words, the borrowed courage, the warm, prepared smile Diane had deployed like a tool. I thought about the 8 months of planning that had preceded that conversation, the deliberate framing, the friend named Celia listening on the phone while Diane practiced the words to use on me. "The key is to make Margaret feel like we're doing her a favor." "Thank you, Renata," I said. "Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly. "I think so," I said. "Yes, I think so." After I hung up, I sat at my small table with the phone in my hand and looked out at the garden in the dark. I could see the outline of the hedge, the rows I had worked on last week. I sat there for a long time. I was not surprised. That was the thing I kept returning to. I was not surprised. Some part of me had known, or at least suspected, that the kindness was constructed, that the concern was costume. What was new was the detail, the specificity, the image of Diane on the phone with Celia rehearsing the words to use on me like lines in a play I hadn't known I was performing in. What I felt was not rage. It was something colder and more settled, the feeling of a person who has been moving in fog and suddenly, for a moment, can see clearly. I called Ethan the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. Mom, hey, how are... I spoke with Renata last night, I said. Silence. I know about Diane opening my mail, I said. I know about the 8 months. I know about the conversation she practiced with her friend Celia. The silence stretched. In it, I could hear him processing. The small, audible recalibration of a person who has just realized the ground has shifted under them again. Mom, I'm not calling to fight, I said. I want you to hear that. I am not calling to fight. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Okay, he said. His voice was careful. Did you know she'd opened my mail? A pause. Too long to be comfortable. I found out afterward, he said. I didn't know she'd done it until she told me what was in it. And when she told you her plan, the framing, the doing you a favor framing, did you go along with it, or did she convince you to? This pause was longer. Ethan, both, he said, and then, almost immediately, I know that's not a good answer. It's an honest one, I said. That's more useful. I wanted the house, he said, and the flatness of it, the absence of excuse, was something I hadn't expected from him. I've wanted it for a long time. Not because I grew up there. I didn't think about what I was asking you to give up. I thought about what I wanted, and I let Diane's reasoning make it feel like the right thing to do. And I knew, somewhere, that it wasn't right. I just didn't look at that part directly. I didn't say anything for a moment. Do you understand, I said slowly, what it felt like to sit at that table? To have a conversation that had been scripted and rehearsed, that had been constructed specifically to make me feel grateful for being pushed out of my own home? His breath on the other end of the line was audible. I think I'm starting to, he said. Good, I said. Keep thinking about it. Diane called me that afternoon. I almost didn't answer. I sat and watched her name on the screen through 3 rings and considered, seriously, letting it go to voicemail. Then I picked up. Margaret. Her voice was a specific kind of bright, the brightness of someone who has decided they are going to be reasonable if it kills them. I think we should talk. All right, I said. I want you to know that I don't blame you for what you did. I understand that you felt. I understand you were hurt, and I think we can move past this as a family if we're all willing to. Diane, I said, I know about Celia. The brightness switched off, just like that. One moment it was there, and the next the line was flat. I beg your pardon, she said. Your friend Celia. The phone calls. The key is to make Margaret feel like we're doing her a favor. I kept my voice completely even. I know about the mail you opened. I know about the 8 months. I know the concern for my welfare was a frame you built around something you wanted. That is... She stopped, started again. That is an enormous exaggeration of what happened. Is it? Margaret, I was trying to find a way to have a difficult conversation that didn't hurt you, that's all. I was trying to be sensitive. You were trying to be effective, I said. There's a difference. I don't know who has been talking to you, but it doesn't matter who told me, I said. It matters that it's true. And I think you know it's true, Diane. I think if you sit quietly with it for 5 minutes, you know that what you did was not sensitivity. It was strategy. And I was the problem you were strategizing around. A long silence. I have never disliked you, I said. I want to be clear about that. I've had my difficulties with you over the years, but I have never disliked you as a person. What I cannot accept, and will not accept, is being managed, being handled, being maneuvered out of my own life by someone who has convinced herself she's doing it for my benefit. So what do you want? Diane said, and underneath the controlled voice was something rawer. What is it you actually want from us, Margaret? Because we've lost the house. That's done. Is this about punishment? Is that what this is? No, I said. This is about the truth. Nothing more than that. She didn't have an answer to that. We ended the call without warmth, without resolution, without any of the theatrical reconciliation that she had probably scripted for this conversation the way she had scripted the first one. I hung up and felt, of all things, hungry. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the garden. There is something I need to tell you about my granddaughter. Sophie was 11 years old, Ethan and Diane's youngest, their only daughter. She had her father's gap-toothed smile, filled in now since she'd lost her baby teeth, and her mother's quickness. She was the kind of child who notices things, the kind who asks questions that are sharper than the adults around her expect, and who has not yet learned to pretend she hasn't noticed what she's noticed. She called me on a Saturday, about a week after my conversation with Diane. She called from Ethan's phone, which meant Ethan had let her. That told me something. "Grandma," she said, "are you really not coming to Thanksgiving?" I hadn't known that was the question on the table. I hadn't known Thanksgiving had become a question at all. It was 3 weeks away. "I hadn't decided anything yet," I said carefully. "Mom says you're probably not coming because of everything that happened." A pause. "She says it might be better for everyone to wait until things settle down." Of course she did. Better for everyone was Diane's linguistic default, a phrase she used the way other people use seasoning, liberally, over everything, regardless of whether it improved the flavor. "What do you think, Sophie?" I asked. A short silence on her end. She was thinking about it for real, which I appreciated. "I think I miss you," she said. "And I think if you're not there, it's going to be weird. And I think—" She lowered her voice slightly. "I think Dad misses you too, but he doesn't know how to say it." 11 years old, seeing everything, saying it plainly. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "Are you okay?" she asked. "In your new house?" "It's a cottage," I said. "And yes, it's small, but it has a garden." "I like gardens," Sophie said. "I know you do. You can come see it whenever you want." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Grandma, why did everything get so messed up?" I thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being unfair, that told her something true without loading things onto her that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to carry. "Because sometimes," I said, "people love each other but forget to respect each other. And when that goes on long enough, things break. But broken things can be fixed if people are willing." "Are you willing?" she asked. I had to smile at that. "Yes," I said. "I am. Are you going to make sure your dad is?" A pause, then, completely seriously, "I'll work on it." Imam. Thanksgiving came. I debated it for 2 full weeks. I ran the conversation in my head from every angle. What it would mean to go, what it would mean to stay away, what I was actually ready for, and what I was not. Carol offered to host in Portland, which would have been the easier choice. Clean slate, no history in the room, just the 2 of us and her husband and their quiet, reasonable apartment. I almost said yes. What stopped me was not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that because forgiveness was still a work in progress, still something I was approaching carefully from the edges rather than walking into directly. What stopped me was Sophie's voice on the phone. "I think if you're not there, it's going to be weird." And the image of my granddaughter sitting at a Thanksgiving table that had been made strange by an absence that she had correctly identified as unnecessary. I had spent enough of my life making myself smaller so other people could be comfortable. I was not about to start making myself absent for the same reason. I called Ethan 3 days before Thanksgiving. "I'll come," I said. "But not to Diane's mother's. Your house." A beat of silence. "We're at a rental," he said. "Since we found a rental while we figure out—" "I know," I said. "Give me the address." He gave it. I wrote it down. He said, "Mom," and then seemed to run out of what came after that. "I'll bring pie," I said. I won't tell you. Thanksgiving was easy. It was not easy. It was awkward in the specific way that only family gatherings can be awkward. Polite on the surface, full of weight underneath, with long pauses that everyone pretended were natural, and topics that people steered around carefully, like furniture that had been moved and not yet memorized. Diane was correct in her manners and cool in her warmth. She thanked me for the pie, showed me where to put my coat, and for most of the evening maintained a careful, civilized distance that was its own kind of statement. I did not push it. I was not there to push anything. Ethan was awkward in the way of someone who wants to make things right and doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. He hovered slightly, refilling my water glass before it was empty, asking twice if I was warm enough. It was almost endearing. Would have been if I hadn't been paying enough attention to notice what was underneath it. The guilt, yes, but also the effort. The genuine, visible effort of a man trying to figure out who he wanted to be going forward. Sophie sat next to me at dinner and told me about her science project, a model of the solar system she'd built with LED lights for the planets, and whether Pluto counted and why the people who decided it didn't were, in her considered opinion, wrong. I listened to every word. I asked questions. I told her that Pluto's reclassification had always struck me as rude as well, and she looked at me with the pure satisfaction of someone who has found the correct ally. After dinner, while Diane was in the kitchen and Ethan was doing something with the dishwasher, Sophie leaned over to me and said quietly, "You seem different." "Different how?" I asked. She thought about it with the seriousness she applied to everything. "Less worried," she said. "You always used to look a little bit worried, like you were waiting for something to go wrong. You don't look like that now." I looked at my granddaughter, this perceptive, unfiltered, extraordinary child. "You might be right," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and reached for the last of the pie. Olts. Driving home that night, I went through town instead of taking the highway. I don't know exactly why. Habit, maybe, or some instinct toward the longer, slower way. The streets were quiet, in the way small towns get on holidays. Most of the lights in most of the houses warm and interior, everything turned inward for the night. I drove past Sycamore Lane. I wasn't planning to. The route didn't require it. But I found myself turning, moving down the familiar street, slowing in front of the house without quite stopping. The lights were on inside. All of them, warm yellow through the curtains. There was a wreath on the door that Vivian Brooks must have hung. Simple, greenery, and a red ribbon, the kind of thing that said people live here and they're paying attention. The low porch light was on. The yard was raked clean. It looked, I thought, like a home that was being lived in, properly, attentively, with care. I sat there for probably 30 seconds, not sad, not regretful, just looking. Then I put the car back in drive and headed to Elmwood Street. The cottage was dark when I pulled up. I'd forgotten to leave a light on, which I always did, which Gerald had always teased me about. I sat in the driveway for a moment before going in, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Something Renata had said in our phone call came back to me then. She had said, near the end, something I hadn't absorbed fully in the moment. "You know, Margaret, what you did took guts. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have just given in." I had thanked her and moved on, but sitting in my dark driveway on Thanksgiving night, I turned the words over. Most people would have given in. I thought about all the years I had given in, the small surrenders, the swallowed words, the absorbed slights, the long practice of making myself fit into whatever space I was offered, rather than insisting on the space I deserved. I had told myself it was love. I had told myself it was generosity. I had told myself, on that night at 11 o'clock at the kitchen table, crying into my hands while everyone slept, I had told myself it was fine. It was just how families worked. It was not a big enough thing to stand up for. It turned out it was always a big enough thing. It had always been. I had just stopped believing I was. I got out of the car, went inside, turned on the lamp in the front room. Small house, quiet house. Mine. I made tea, sat in my chair by the window, and let the evening settle around me. Tomorrow there would be more. More conversations, more careful navigation, more of the slow and imperfect work of whatever came next between me and my son, between me and Diane, between the person I had been for 68 years and the person I was apparently still becoming. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the tea was hot, and the chair was comfortable, and outside the window the street was still and dark and entirely unremarkable. I drank my tea and did not feel small. The weeks after Thanksgiving moved differently than the weeks before it. Not easier exactly, but different. The quality of the difficulty changed, less like bracing against something coming, more like working through something already here. There is a distinction between those two kinds of hard. And if you have lived long enough, you know exactly what I mean. Ethan called more regularly now. Not the frantic accusatory calls of those first days after he'd found the house empty, and not the careful, rehearsed check-ins of someone managing a situation. These calls were unpolished in a way his earlier ones hadn't been. He'd call and not always have a reason, not always have an agenda. He'd ask what I was doing and actually listen to the answer. He told me one Thursday afternoon that he'd been having trouble sleeping. "How long?" I asked. "Since October mostly," he said. Since around when Diane and I first talked about the house." I thought about that. "Your conscience was already working on it," I said. A pause. "Maybe," he said. "I didn't think of it that way." "What did you think of it as?" "Stress," he said. "I told myself it was work stress." That was so recognizably human, the practiced misidentification of guilt as something more manageable, that I almost said so out loud. I didn't. Some things a person has to arrive at themselves, and saying it out loud too soon just gives them something to argue with instead of something to sit with. "Are you sleeping better now?" I asked. A short pause. "A little," he said. "Some nights." It wasn't resolution. It wasn't even close to resolution. But it was something. What I was not prepared for was the next thing Diane did. I should have been. Looking back, I can see the shape of it coming, the way you can see the shape of weather moving in from the west if you know what to look for. But I wasn't looking. I was, perhaps for the first time in years, looking primarily at my own life, at the garden, at the Tuesday walking group, at the small routines of the cottage that were becoming mine, in a way the house on Sycamore Lane had stopped being mine sometime in the last few years, without my fully noticing. I found out from Dorothy. Dorothy called me on a Wednesday in early December, and the tone of her voice when I picked up told me before the words did that something had gone sideways. "Margaret," she said, "I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else." "Tell me," I said. "Diane has been talking to people," Dorothy said, "in the community. She's been telling people that the sale was... She's implying that you weren't competent to make the decision, that you may not have fully understood what you were signing." I sat down. "She's been talking to your neighbor Patrice," Dorothy continued, "and to the Hendersons, I believe. I heard it from Karen Marsh, who heard it from Patrice directly. The phrase being used is that she's concerned about your clarity of mind at the time of the sale." Clarity of mind. Two words constructed to sound like concern and function like a weapon. "Is she planning to challenge the sale?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I don't know," Dorothy said. "I don't think she has legal grounds. The sale was clean, Margaret, completely clean. Everything was in order. But I wanted you to know what was circulating, because people talk, and some of them will believe it without questioning it, and I thought you deserved to know." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I have to tell you what that felt like, because I think it is important. Not the anger, though there was anger, yes, a clean, bright anger that I felt first in my chest and then in my hands. But underneath the anger was something that took me longer to identify. It was grief. Not grief for the house, not grief for the version of Ethan I was slowly relearning. Grief for the particular illusion I had apparently still been carrying without knowing it. The illusion that the worst of it was behind us. That Thanksgiving had meant something definitive. That we were, however slowly and imperfectly, moving forward. Diane had not moved forward. Diane was doing what Diane did, strategizing, building a new frame around the situation, a frame in which I was not a woman who had made a difficult and deliberate choice, but a confused old woman who hadn't known what she was doing. It was the same move, dressed differently. First she had tried to make me feel like leaving was my idea. Now she was trying to make everyone else believe the decision hadn't really been mine at all. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about what kind of woman does this. Constructs one narrative when the first one fails, pivots without apparent discomfort, treats other people's dignity as an obstacle to be managed around. And then I thought, what am I going to do about it? I called Ethan that evening. Not the next day, not after sleeping on it. That evening. He picked up sounding tired, the way he usually did around 7 now. "Mom, hey." I need to tell you what Diane has been saying to people, I said, and I need you to tell me what you're going to do about it. Silence. I told him. All of it. Patrice, the Hendersons, clarity of mind, Dorothy's call. I kept it factual. I did not editorialize. I gave him the information the way you give someone a set of documents, clearly, in order, without embellishment, and let the content speak. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone again. Ethan? I'm here, he said. Did you know about this? No. The word came out fast and flat, with the particular texture of something that is true. No, I didn't know. Are you sure? Mom, I swear to you, I didn't know. I believed him. That was the thing. I actually believed him, and I wasn't entirely sure if that made it better or worse. Better, because it meant the person I had been cautiously relearning to trust had not deceived me again. Worse, because it meant the woman he had married was operating independently, running her own campaign, and he apparently had not known. You need to make this stop, I said. I know. Not for my sake alone, I said. For yours. Because if you allow this to continue, if you let this become the story your wife tells about your mother, you are making a choice, Ethan. Even doing nothing is a choice. A long pause. I know, he said again, and this time it had more weight in it. I have never once, I said, and I felt the steadiness in my own voice like a floor under me, told a single person that you are a bad son. I have not gone to Dorothy's clients. I have not called Patrice. I have not sat at lunch with the Hendersons and raised questions about your character. What I did legally, on my own property, within my full rights. And I am 68 years old, and I will not have my mind questioned by a woman who opened my private mail and practiced talking me out of my home on the phone with her friends. The silence on his end had a different quality now, not the silence of someone gathering themselves for a response. The silence of someone who has just heard something that has landed fully, without deflection. I'm going to talk to her tonight, he said. Good. Mom. His voice shifted. I'm sorry. I know I keep saying that, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but It's not about fixing it, I said. It's about what you do next. That's all. Just what you do next. I don't know exactly what Ethan said to Diane that night. He didn't tell me the specifics, and I didn't ask for them. There are rooms in other people's marriages you don't enter, even when you have reason to, even when the marriage in question has caused you direct harm. Whatever happened behind that door was between the two of them, and what came after it was what mattered to me. What came after it, 3 days later, was a phone call from Diane. She called in the morning, around 10, when she knew I'd be home. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of drama, but out of the simple need to take 2 breaths and decide what I was going to give this conversation. Margaret, she said. Diane. I want to apologize. The words came out measured, carefully syllabled, like she had worked on their arrangement. I said things to people that were unfair, that were untrue. I was angry, and I handled it badly. I waited a moment. Is there more? I asked. A short pause, the kind where someone is deciding how much further they're willing to go. I also want to say, the way this whole situation was handled from the beginning was not right. I know that. I pushed Ethan into a conversation that should have been handled differently. I wasn't thinking about you the way I should have been. It was not a complete accounting. There were things in that apology that had been carefully omitted. The Celia calls, the 8 months, the mail. She had given me a version that acknowledged enough to qualify as an apology without committing to the full truth of what she'd done. I noticed that. I filed it. But here is what I have learned at 68 years old about apologies. They are not always going to be everything you need them to be, and waiting for the perfect one is a way of giving someone else permanent power over your peace. What matters is whether the behavior changes. An imperfect apology followed by changed behavior is worth more than a perfect apology followed by nothing. Thank you for saying so, I said. And I meant it, not warmly, but honestly. She stopped, started again. I'd like things to be better between us. I know they won't be what they were, but better. Better is a reasonable goal, I said. It was not a reconciliation. It was more like a ceasefire. Both parties still holding their positions, but agreeing to stop firing for now. I could work with a ceasefire. I had worked with less. January came, cold and quiet, and good, in the way that Januaries sometimes are, when you stop dreading them and let them be what they are. My garden was dormant, which meant I had more time for other things. I had signed up in December for a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, something I had meant to do for 20 years and had always found a reason to defer. The class met on Thursday mornings, 12 people around a long table with cheap palettes and good light from north-facing windows. I was not talented. My first 3 attempts looked like something a child had done before fully understanding what water does to paper. The instructor, a patient woman named Bev, told me I was overworking the paint, which turned out to be a useful observation about more than just painting. I went back every week. I also, in January, had a conversation that I hadn't expected to have, but that turned out to matter more than almost anything else that happened during this time. Harold Brooks called me. I nearly didn't recognize the number. He had to identify himself, and even then it took me a moment. Harold Brooks, from the house on Sycamore Lane. And then I remembered the large, soft-spoken man with the history teacher's patience, and Vivian with her quick eyes. And the afternoon I had shown them the low ceiling and told them about Gerald. "I hope I'm not intruding," Harold said. "Dorothy gave me your number. I asked her to ask you first. I didn't want to call if you'd rather not." "I don't mind," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. "We found something," he said. "In the house, during moving in, a box in the back of the upstairs closet. We weren't sure how to return it. We didn't want to just mail it. And we thought, if you were willing, we might meet somewhere." The box. I knew immediately which box. I didn't say so. I just said, "Yes, I'd like that." PM. We met at a coffee shop downtown the following Saturday. Harold and Vivian arrived together, Harold carrying the box under one arm, with the careful attention of someone transporting something fragile. Which it was, in every way except the literal one. It was the box of Ethan's drawings. The stick figures and the 2 long arms and the labeled "Mom and Me holding hands." I had forgotten it entirely in the controlled urgency of those last weeks of packing, the deliberate compartmentalization of emotion I'd needed to get through the process. I had left it in the closet, and I had not, until this moment, let myself acknowledge that I had. Harold set it on the table between us. "We figured it was important," he said simply. "It is," I said. Vivian looked at me with those quick, warm eyes. "Are you settling in all right?" she asked. "To the new place." "Better than I expected," I said. "It's smaller, but it's mine in a way the other house hadn't been for a while." She nodded in that way she had, not with sympathy, with recognition. "We're taking good care of it," she said. "I want you to know that." "I can tell," I said. "I drove past at Thanksgiving, the wreath on the door." Harold smiled. "Vivian's project." "It looked right," I said, and I meant it without grief, which surprised me a little. It looked right, and that was enough. We sat for almost an hour. Harold told me about his years teaching, some story about a student who had become a state senator and still sent a card every Christmas. Vivian told me about the garden. She'd found my tomato stakes still stored in the shed and wanted to know what varieties I'd grown. I told her, and we talked about the differences between early girls and better boys, with the focused pleasure of 2 people who take the same thing seriously. It was an ordinary conversation, a good one. When I picked up the box to leave, Harold stood and held the door for me and said, "Thank you for the house, Margaret. I mean that." I looked at this man who had appreciated a low ceiling, who had said, "This is a good house," in a voice that understood what he was saying. "Take care of that ceiling in the hallway," I said. "Don't fix it." He looked surprised for a moment, and then his face settled into something that understood without needing explanation. "We won't," he said. "What?" I drove home with this box on the passenger seat. I didn't open it until that evening, after dinner, after the light had changed to that particular winter blue that comes in through west-facing windows around 4 o'clock and makes everything look quieter than it is. I sat on the couch and lifted the lid. They were all there, 40-something drawings, maybe more. I didn't count. Crayon and marker and pencil, on pages torn from notebooks and on proper drawing paper and on the backs of old envelopes. The figures were exactly as I remembered, slightly lopsided, arms too long. The M on mom reversed in some of them, the way children reverse letters before they've fully decided on direction. I went through them slowly, one by one. There was one I didn't remember, or maybe I had forgotten it, the way you forget individual instances of ordinary happiness. It showed 3 figures instead of 2. The labels read Mom, Me, Dad. Gerald's stick figure was the tallest, which was accurate. They were all holding hands in a chain, the arms stretching to reach each other, all slightly too long, all connected. I held that one for a while. Here is what I know about my son. He is not a villain. I know that sounds strange after everything I have told you, but it is true, and it is important. He is a man who made a series of choices over a number of years. Some of them selfish, some of them weak, some of them cowardly in the specific way that cowardice presents itself when it's disguised as practicality. He had listened to his wife's plans and told himself they were reasonable. He had stopped seeing his mother clearly and told himself he was handling things responsibly. He had borrowed money and stopped repaying it and told himself the relationship was more than the debt, which was true. But using it as an excuse not to honor the debt was still wrong. He had done all of this without being a villain, without malice, with the ordinary human failure of a person who chose comfort over conscience for long enough that he had stopped noticing the choosing. I knew this about him. I had always known it. And knowing it didn't excuse any of it, but it did mean something for what came next. What came next was a conversation we had in February, over dinner at a restaurant downtown that was neutral ground for both of us. No history in the booths, no associations in the lighting. Ethan arrived before me and was sitting at the table when I came in. He stood when he saw me, which he had not always done, which I noticed without saying so. We ordered without much ceremony. We talked about Sophie's science project. She had won a second-place ribbon at the school fair, which she was furious about, and which Ethan described with the specific helpless pride of a parent watching their child's competitive nature exceed their ability to manage it. I laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. He looked at me when I laughed, and something in his face shifted. Something careful and held loosened slightly, like a person who had been bracing for something and wasn't sure yet if it was safe to stop. "Mom," he said, "I want to pay back the rest of the money." I looked at him. "Ethan, not because I'm not doing it to balance a ledger. I'm doing it because it's right. It's been wrong for a long time, and I should have dealt with it years ago, and I didn't." He paused. "I set up a payment arrangement. Nothing dramatic, just monthly over 2 years. I wanted to tell you." I looked at my son across the table. The gap-toothed smile was long gone, filled in with adult teeth, but around the eyes he still looked, sometimes, like the boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms and hidden it badly. "All right," I said. "That's it?" he said. "Just all right?" "What did you expect?" He considered. "More," he said. "Or less. I'm not sure which." "It's the right thing," I said. "I'm not going to make a ceremony out of you doing the right thing. That sets the bar too low." He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the strained, careful smile of the last several months, but something more like his real one. "You've always been like this," he said. "You know that? Even when I was a kid. No ceremony for the right thing. You just expected it. Did that bother you?" He thought about it seriously. "Sometimes," he said, "but I think it made me a better person than I would have been otherwise, when I bothered to listen." "You stopped listening for a while," I said. "I know." No defense, no qualification, just, "I know." "You seem to have started again," I said. He nodded. And we sat with that for a moment, the two of us, in a restaurant with no history between us, letting that small and imperfect and genuinely hard-won thing exist between us without trying to make it more than it was. The food came. We ate. The conversation moved to other things: Carol's new job, Sophie's obsession with Pluto's reclassification, a television show Ethan had been watching that he thought I might like. It was, on the surface, an ordinary dinner. Underneath, it was anything but. It was two people doing the slow, unbeautiful, necessary work of finding out who they were going to be to each other going forward. It was the hardest kind of love. Not the easy kind, not the kind that runs on assumption and habit and unexamined history. The kind that has been taken apart and has to be rebuilt piece by careful piece without the guarantee that all the pieces are going to fit the way they used to. I drove home that night thinking about Gerald, thinking about something he had said to me once, early in our marriage, during one of our first real fights. A bad one. Ugly enough that we'd both said things we regretted. When we'd come through the other side of it, shaken and exhausted and still angry at the edges, he had sat down across from me and said, "The measure of a relationship isn't whether it breaks. Everything breaks. The measure is what people do in the break." I had not thought about that in years. It came back to me completely, in his voice, the way some memories do. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door opening. I sat with it the rest of the way home. What people do in the break. I thought I was beginning to find out. Spring came to Elmwood Street the way it always does in this part of the world. Not all at once, not with any particular drama, but in small increments that you almost miss until suddenly one morning you look out the window and the hedge is green and you don't remember when that happened. I had been in the cottage for 6 months. 6 months sounds like a short time when you say it out loud. It felt, from the inside, like considerably more. Not in a heavy way, not the slow drag of unhappy time, but in the way that time expands when you are actually living it rather than moving through it on autopilot. I had done more in those 6 months than I had done in the previous 2 years combined. The garden, the walking group, the watercolor class, where I had graduated from overworked disasters to paintings that were merely mediocre, which Bev told me was real progress and which I chose to believe. A book club on the second Wednesday of every month, 8 women in a living room with wine and strong opinions about fiction. Roy from the walking group, who had started staying after the walk to have coffee with me and 3 others, and who had turned out to be a retired civil engineer with a dry sense of humor and strong feelings about bridge design that were, against all odds, interesting. I was building something, not what I had lost. You can't rebuild what you've lost, and trying is a way of refusing to move forward. Something different. Something that fit the shape of the life I actually had, rather than the life I had been living around. And then, on a Wednesday morning in late March, I got a call that cracked everything open again. It was Ethan, but not the careful, trying hard Ethan of the last few months. This voice was different, urgent, and stripped down, without the usual management of tone. "Mom, it's Sophie." I sat down immediately. What happened? Tell me." "She's okay," he said, fast, because he knew that was the first thing. "She's okay. She's at the hospital, but she's okay. She fell at school, off the climbing structure in the gym, and she landed badly, and they think her wrist might be broken, and she—" When they were trying to reach Diane, before they got through, "Sophie, she asked for you." I was already standing up, already reaching for my keys. "What hospital?" I said. He told me. I was in my car in 4 minutes. The drive took 20 minutes. I will not tell you I was calm, because I was not. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my chest was doing something tight and complicated that I recognized as the particular terror of a grandparent, the specific, acute vulnerability of loving a child you did not make yourself, which somehow makes the love not smaller but more vertiginous, more frightening, because you have less illusion of control. Sophie was in a curtained bay in the pediatric wing when I arrived. Her left wrist was wrapped, and her face was pale and tear-streaked, and she was trying very hard not to look like she had been crying, which meant she had been crying quite a lot. Ethan was on one side of her. Diane arrived 10 minutes after I did, brisk and frightened and trying to cover the frightened with the brisk. When Sophie saw me come through the curtain, she said, "Grandma," in the voice of a child who has been holding herself together and has just seen the person they can stop holding together for. I sat on the edge of the bed and she leaned into me and I held her, this 11-year-old girl with her wrapped wrist and her damp face, and I didn't say anything useful. There was nothing useful to say. I just held her. After a moment she said, into my shoulder, "It hurts." "I know," I said. "The doctor said it's a clean break," she said. which apparently is the good kind, which seems like a weird thing to say. It is a weird thing to say, I agreed. She pulled back slightly and looked at me. Her eyes were still red, but she was steadying. They're going to put a cast on it, she said. I get to pick the color. What color are you thinking? She considered it with complete seriousness, the way she considered everything. Purple, she said, but not a babyish purple, a deep purple. A dignified purple, I said. Exactly. I looked at my granddaughter and felt, underneath the receding terror, something else. Something that was harder to name, but had to do with the particular grace of being needed. Genuinely needed, not as a convenience or an inheritance, but as a person. The person this child had asked for, in a hospital bay, before she could reach her mother. I had spent so many years making myself available in ways that felt invisible. This was different. This was being chosen. We stayed at the hospital for 3 hours. Sophie got her cast, a deep, dignified purple, as specified, and came home with instructions and a prescription and a look of slightly theatrical suffering that told me she was feeling well enough to enjoy the drama of the situation. Diane pulled me aside near the elevator while Ethan was signing the discharge paperwork. I wasn't sure what to expect from her. The last months had been a careful, imperfect truce, real in its way, but not warm, not close, not anything I would have called resolved. Thank you for coming, she said. Of course, I said, I mean it. She paused, and in the pause I could see her working at something. Some interior negotiation that I was not privy to, but whose difficulty was visible on her face. She wanted you. Before she wanted me, she wanted you. I've been thinking about what that means. I didn't say anything. I waited. I think, Diane said slowly, that I owe you more than an apology about the house and the things I said to people. I think I owe you an apology for the last several years, for the way I treated you in that house, like you were in the way of something instead of the reason it existed. This was more than she had given me before, more complete, more uncomfortable for her to say, and therefore more real. Diane, I said, I'm not going to pretend the last year was nothing. It was something. It hurt. But I'm also not going to hold the rest of our lives hostage to it. That's not useful for either of us, and it's not useful for Sophie. She nodded. She looked for the first time in all the months I had known her, genuinely tired rather than managed. The careful brightness was gone. What was under it was a woman who was not entirely at peace with herself, which made her, paradoxically, easier to be in a room with. I want to do better, she said. I'm telling you that because I think you deserve to hear it directly, not through Ethan. All right, I said. I'll hold you to that. The elevator opened. We went in together. Sophie's broken wrist became, in the strange way of families, a turning point. Not because of the injury itself. She healed cleanly, as the doctor had promised, and had her cast off in 6 weeks and returned to climbing structures with no apparent alteration to her risk tolerance, which was both alarming and reassuring. But something about that day in the hospital, Sophie asking for me, Diane's conversation by the elevator, the 3 hours we had all spent in the same room with our walls slightly down because there was no energy left to hold them up. Something about it shifted the ground underneath all of us. Ethan called the day after and said, "Can we try dinners again? Regular ones. Not special occasion, just dinner." "Whose house?" I asked. "Yours sometimes," he said. "If you're willing, I think Sophie would like that. She wants to see the garden." "Tell her the tomatoes go in after last frost," I said. "She can help me plant them." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, and there was something in it. A smallness, a kind of hope that he hadn't quite earned the right to show me yet, but was showing me anyway, because he was trying. "Yes," I said. Sophie came to the cottage the following Saturday, cast still on, and stood in the garden with her hands on her hips, her good hand and her purple cast, and told me with considerable authority that the spacing on my seedling trays was wrong. "Where did you learn about seedling spacing?" I asked. "YouTube," she said. "Of course." "Let me see what you think then." She crouched down with the careful awkwardness of a child protecting an injury and examined my setup with genuine concentration. She was right about the spacing. I told her so, which delighted her in the way that being right always delighted Sophie, which was completely and without false modesty. We spent 2 hours in the garden. She asked about everything: what grew where and why, which plants were difficult and which were forgiving, whether I was going to try growing anything I'd never grown before. I told her I was thinking about dahlias, which I had always meant to try and never had. "We should do it," she said, "this year. Me and you." "You'll have to come back regularly to help," I said. "I know," she said, like this was obvious. "I'm planning to." I looked at this child with her purple cast and her certainty and her complete matter-of-fact assumption that she would be part of whatever came next, and I felt something I can only describe as the future arriving. Not the future I had feared. The managed one, the laminated menu one, the one where I disappeared quietly into whatever space was left over after everyone else had taken what they wanted. A different future. One with dirt under the fingernails and an 11-year-old's strong opinions about seedling spacing and dahlias that nobody had planted yet. I want to tell you now about the money, because it matters, and because I don't want to leave it unfinished. Ethan made the first payment in February, as he had said he would. He made the second in March, the third in April. He didn't make a ceremony of it, and neither did I. It appeared in my account on roughly the same date each month, and I noted it and moved on. But in May, something happened that I didn't expect. He called me one evening and said, "I want to pay off the remainder, all at once. I got a contract bonus and I want to use it for this." "Ethan." "Let me," he said. It wasn't quite a request. It was something between a request and a statement of intent, which was a combination I recognized. He had gotten it from me. "I know it doesn't erase anything, but I want there to be no... I want it done. I don't want it sitting between us anymore, even quietly." I thought about the savings account that Gerald and I had built for 30 years. The money that had gone to Ethan and come back in pieces over 6 years and now was coming back at last. Not perfectly, not in the way it had left, but honestly, with acknowledgement, which was more than I had expected. "All right," I said. "Do it." The money transferred the following week. I sat with the bank notification for a while before I did anything with it. I thought about what to do. Practical things, responsible things, things Gerald would have nodded at approvingly. And then I thought about something else entirely. I called Dorothy. Not about a sale, not about a purchase, about something smaller. There was a studio apartment above a shop on Fairview Street, 2 miles from the cottage, not for me, but for someone else. Carol had mentioned carefully, twice, that she had been thinking about coming back closer to home. Her husband had the option to work remotely. Portland had been good to them, but it had always been a practical choice rather than a heart one. And the last year, watching what had happened with our family from 3 hours away, had apparently settled something for her. The studio wasn't for Carol, it was for a down payment on a conversation. I called her that evening and said, "If you were thinking about coming home, I might have some thoughts about how." The silence on the other end lasted about 3 seconds, and then she said, "Mom, are you serious?" "I've been thinking about it for a while." "I've been thinking about it for a while too," she said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time and has just been given permission. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the practicalities, not yet. Those came later in subsequent conversations, in the careful planning of two people who know each other well enough to know where the stumbling blocks will be. That first night we just talked, the way we hadn't talked since those 4 days after I left the house, when she made coffee in the mornings and understood without being told when silence was more useful than words. I had missed my daughter every day she'd been 3 hours away. I had not said so, because she had her own life and her own choices, and I was not the kind of mother who measured love in proximity. But I had missed her, every day. But summer came. Sophie and I planted the dahlias in late May, after last frost, in the sunniest corner of the garden. She came every 2 weeks to check on them, arriving on her bicycle with a confidence that suggested the broken wrist had not taught her any lessons about caution, which was both exasperating and correct. She brought her notebook and took actual notes, which I found hilarious and didn't say so, because I didn't want to discourage the instinct. In June, on a Saturday afternoon, I had a dinner at the cottage. A real one. Carol and her husband making the drive down. Ethan and Sophie. Even Roy from the walking group, who had become a fixture in my life in the low-key, undemonstrative way of people who show up regularly without making a production of it. I made too much food, which was always my default, and we ate at the table I had moved outside into the garden because the evening was warm enough and the garden was, by now, worth sitting in. Diane came. I want to be accurate about this, because I think accuracy matters more than tidiness. It was not easy. She and I were not easy together, not yet, maybe not for a long time. There was still distance between us that was real and earned and not going to evaporate because we'd both decided to try harder. She was careful with me and I was honest with her, and we stayed on the surface of things, which was probably the right place to be for where we were. But she came. She sat at the table in my garden and ate my food and was decent to Carol and made Sophie laugh twice, which is not a small thing because Sophie's standards for what was worth laughing at were high and non-negotiable. And at the end of the evening, when everyone was leaving, she said to me quietly, "Thank you for having us." And it was simple and unrehearsed, without the careful brightness, just a woman saying a true thing. "Thank you for coming," I said. Neither of us tried to make it more than it was. That was progress. I want to talk to you now, directly, person to person, because I have been telling you this story for a long time, and I think you deserve more than just the events. You deserve what I actually took from it, what I learned at 68 years old, the hard way, through 47 years of a particular kind of quiet sacrifice, and one decisive October morning when I finally stopped. Here's the first thing. Love is not the same as loyalty, and loyalty is not the same as self-erasure. I spent decades confusing all three. I thought that loving my son meant being endlessly available, endlessly patient, endlessly willing to absorb the cost of whatever he needed. I thought refusing to ask for what I needed was the same as being a good mother. It was not. It was a form of cowardice, my own, not his. The cowardice of someone who is afraid that if she names what she needs, the love will turn out to be conditional on her not needing anything. Here's the second thing. The moment you begin managing your own needs away so that other people can be comfortable, you have started your own disappearance. And you can do it so gradually, across so many years of small silent retreats, that by the time you notice you have become invisible, you can barely remember what it felt like to be seen. I had done this. I owned it. Ethan had failed me, yes. Diane had been calculating and unkind, yes. But I had also cooperated. I had been so determined to be uncomplicated, so afraid of being seen as demanding or difficult, that I had handed people the means of dismissing me. I had made it easy. Here's the third thing, and this one is for anyone listening who is older, who is watching their children begin to look at you like a situation to be managed. You have rights. Not just legal rights, though you have those too, and do not forget them, but human rights. The right to your own decisions, your own property, your own future. The right to be consulted, not maneuvered. The right to say no to arrangements made for your supposed benefit that you did not choose. The right to be seen as a person with preferences and intelligence and a life that matters, not as a responsibility to be efficiently discharged. Nobody can take those rights without your cooperation. That is the hardest part and the most important part. They can pressure you. They can manipulate you. They can make you feel like resistance is selfishness, like wanting to stay in your own home is unreasonable, like the kindest thing you could do for everyone is to quietly disappear. But they cannot take what you do not give. Here's the fourth thing. Walking away from the wrong version of peace is not destruction. I did not destroy my family when I sold that house. I refused to disappear, which is different. And because I refused, something real became possible. Not a perfect relationship, not a clean ending, but a true one. What Ethan and I have now is harder earned and therefore more honest than what we had before, when the peace was maintained at the cost of my existence. And the fifth thing, perhaps the most important, is this. It is never too late to choose yourself. Not at 50, not at 68, not at 83. The part of you that knows what you deserve does not have an age. It waits. Sometimes it waits for decades, patient in the way that deep water is patient, not urgent but persistent. And if you are willing to listen to it, not the part that flinches, not the part that worries what people will think, but the part that knows, it will tell you, clearly and without drama, exactly what needs to happen next. I listened, finally, on a Tuesday morning in October, when my son said the wrong words over hot oatmeal in my kitchen, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. I have not stopped listening since. Shita. The dahlias bloomed in August. I want to tell you about that because it was not a metaphor I planned. It just happened, the way real things happen, without arranging themselves for effect. Sophie was there when the first ones opened because she had been tracking their progress in her notebook since May and had apparently calculated the approximate bloom window within about a 4-day margin, which she announced with satisfaction as entirely predicted. They were extraordinary. That is not sentimentality. I am not a sentimental woman, as you have probably gathered by now. They were simply extraordinary the way things are when they have been tended properly and given enough time. Deep red ones, and one that was almost orange, and several in a purple that Sophie said was very close to her cast color, which she considered appropriate. We stood in the garden in the late afternoon light, this child and I, looking at the thing we had grown together, and Sophie put her hand, her healed hand, fully healed, no trace of the break, on my arm. "We did that," she said. "We did," I said. She leaned against me, briefly, the way children do when they are too old to be held, but still, sometimes, want to be close. She smelled like bicycle and garden dirt and the particular coconut sunscreen that Diane bought in bulk and that I had come to associate entirely with Sophie. "Are you happy, Grandma?" she asked. I thought about the question honestly, the way it deserved. I thought about the house on Sycamore Lane, and the low ceiling, and the box of drawings, and the oatmeal burning on the stove while I stood very still and understood what was happening to me. I thought about the Tuesday morning and Dorothy Kessler, and the night I had sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock and cried into my hands. I thought about the cold clarity of deciding to stop. I thought about Elmwood Street and the cottage and the walking group, and Roy's feelings about bridge design and the watercolor class, and Carol coming home in the fall, and this garden, this specific corner of it, these dahlias that nobody had expected and nobody had planted for me, that I had chosen for myself. "Yes," I said, "not the way I expected, but yes." Sophie nodded like this was the correct answer she had been waiting to confirm. "Good," she said. She straightened up, picked up her notebook from the garden wall where she'd set it, and said, "The orange ones need deadheading next week or they'll stop producing. I'll come back Thursday." "I'll make lunch," I said. She got on her bicycle and rode down the street without looking back, the way children ride when they are confident that wherever they're going, they'll be fine. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the garden, my small, extraordinary garden, and I looked at what was growing there in the late August light. I had built a house once. 47 years of my life had gone into its walls. I thought for a long time that losing it meant losing the most important thing I had ever made. I was wrong. The most important thing I had ever made was still making itself. Right here, in this cottage, in this garden, in the careful, imperfect, rebuilt relationship with my son, in the lunch I would make on Thursday, in Carol coming home in October, in the dahlias that Sophie and I had planted together, and that had no idea they were supposed to be a metaphor. I was still here, still building, still becoming. That, I have learned, is enough. More than enough. That in the end is everything.